Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your bank of knowledge of investments, economics, and geopolitics. Go to goldnewsletter.com for our publications and archives to increase your wealth monetarily and educationally.
This is Fergus Hodgson with the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm delighted to have Valentin Schmid today to discuss the threat of China. We've all heard a lot about this, and this man knows it so well. He is the business editor of the Epoch Times, which is an international outlet that with a particular interest, and he's going to explain the background to this publication, but with a particular interest in the communist regime and what's going on in China. And he was also a portfolio manager for a big French bank, BNP Paribas, and he conducted his role in Hong Kong, so right there. Valentin, welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast.
Hey, Fergus, thank you very much. And you did pick a good topic, because it's true that over the years I have studied China in detail. So I hope I can tell you some interesting things.
There's so much to talk about here. I mean, it's just such a big topic and an important one. Before we actually get into the meat of the issue, though, why don't you just explain your relationship with Epoch Times and how their publication came into existence?
Yeah, that's another interesting story. So obviously, everybody here knows your penchant for freedom and independence and intellectual honesty, and that's why we are a good fit, because Epoch Times is actually, I always like to say, a Chinese anti-propaganda, which was founded by expat Chinese and in some cases refugees, because they had to leave China after the communist regime started to persecute the Falun Gong spiritual practice.
When did that begin?
That was in 1999. Yeah, it's already almost 20 years ago.
Okay.
Crazy. And this keeps going on with the most horrible atrocity being the organ harvesting, where they kill off practitioners of conscience, not just Falun Gong practitioners, but prisoners of conscience. But mostly those, they have them on file, and then if somebody needs a heart or liver or whatever, they just kill them off on demand. And there's some shocking documentaries about that, including investigative reportings where they call the hospitals, the military hospitals in many cases, and they're like, yeah, I need an organ, I need a heart, do you have one? Next week they're like, yeah, sure, we have it. It's like, yeah, is it from Falun Gong practitioners? Yeah, we have those. It's crazy. It's absolutely insane.
It's hard to believe, and so there's a very sinister, dark underbelly to China. And I don't even know if it's an underbelly. Maybe it's just right out in front of everyone's eyes if you want to look. But so the challenge I have in understanding the role of China is that on the one hand, I see this nation expanding its influence around the world and engaging in espionage. We can discuss how they do that. But at the same time, I hear very pessimistic reviews of the economy. One man who's become famous for predicting the collapse of China is Gordon Chang. I assume you're familiar with this guy.
Yeah, I know him.
Yeah, so he's written The Coming Collapse of China. He wrote it back in 2001.
It's a bit early, but... Yeah.
So he's predicted it multiple times for not to quite come to be. So what is going on? On the one hand, like you said, we see this expanding power, but on the other hand, maybe a paper tiger in terms of its actual economic clout.
So you're asking me about the economy and this dichotomy, and
yeah,
I will definitely...
the expanding political power, but at the same time, the problems with the economy. These seem to work against each other.
So I will definitely answer that. To round it off, you asked me, I forgot about that. I got too lost in the details. But you asked me about Epoch Times, and I told you about the organ harvesting. So just very quickly to round that off.
Oh, yeah, sure.
We have been reporting on that topic for a long time, because the founders were Falun Gong practitioners, and that's why we have this independent, I wouldn't say unbiased view, that would be too much. That's why I say it's anti-propaganda, and we are independent, and we have a lot of inside sources in China who give us information. And by now, the Chinese edition is the largest independent Chinese media in the world. So Chinese anti-propaganda reporting on the human rights abuses, but also we do have a big clout because we still get a lot of inside information, and we have branched off into English, French, German, you name it, different editions. So much for Epoch. Now to your question about the economy, and I would agree with you, and the politics, I would agree with you. That's what the people have an issue with. I mean, people tend to have an issue with that in general. They cannot look at things in a nuanced perspective. So you have people like Gordon Chang, who says China's going to collapse, and they may, who knows. And then you have people like Stephen Roach and the McKinsey people, who are like the Kool-Aiders. They're like, oh, China's going to overtake the US. And then you look at both of those positions, and then if you really look at it honestly, they are lacking the nuance. Where on the one hand, it is true that the Chinese have found a way to utilize the vast resources of formerly cheap labor by getting in and stealing a lot of Western capital and technology. And so they've grown a lot, and they are now, whether I don't like purchasing power parity, but even if you use the exchange rates, the official ones, they are the second largest economy in the world. It's not very difficult if you have 1.3 billion people, but having said that, it's also, you can't deny that many regions in China, not all of them, mostly the coast, they have achieved a relatively high standard of development. So even though it was still mostly state directed, they gave some freedom to the people, and the people used it for production. And so it's not a miracle, it's just normal. And if you have 1.3 billion people, then that's what happens. And with this, of course, they are one of the biggest, maybe it's the European Union trading nation in the world. So obviously, also their political influence and clout has increased, especially with smaller countries who are sort of still buying into this, oh, if we deal with China, we're all going to get rich philosophy and mentality. But as we all know, how does this work between a corrupt third world country in Africa and a statist communist country in China? It's basically the officials make deals that benefit mostly the officials, especially in the local, in the African country, and then the Chinese workers come in and they build whatever they want to build, and the country is settled with debts, and the people have to pay it off. So this is also, it's not like Western nations didn't do similar things. It's just China does it in a more crude way, but because they provide some sort of competition to the West, they're having, I would say, limited success with it, because, and this is where we transition into the domestic economic problem. Most of these investments are not very productive. Like if you done some research about the One Belt, One Road, where everybody's throwing around these $1 trillion figures, and then you see the investments that they actually have made that are operational, which are in the tens of billions at most, are not very productive. They're either not running at all, or they're running way below capacity. So it's a waste of money.
Do you want to clarify this Belt and Road Initiative? Because for many people, they won't have heard of that term. And what exactly is the objective here? So my sense is that maybe the goal is not economic productivity. There are other goals. So perhaps even if these investments aren't really showing economic fruits, maybe they're achieving other motives.
Yeah, sure. So the One Belt, One Road is this huge, some people dub it the Chinese Marshall Plan, but not for Europe. It's for Central Asia mostly, and Southeast Asia, where China is just investing. And this is also not true. It's not them who are buying stuff or giving away. It's many loans, many things that the countries themselves are doing, and are hiring Chinese companies with huge infrastructure investments in military, electricity, railways, roads. And this is supposed to bring a revival to the old Silk Road that we had back in the days. And yeah, of course, they're trying to pursue other objectives and trying to make those countries like Pakistan subservient to them and luring them away from the West. But as the West has learned during the last couple of decades, those countries just aren't reliable partners. And China is not going to be able to change that. And they're not going to be able to change the corruption and the lack of business mentality that those countries have. It's almost impossible. I mean, people have been trying that for decades. And in rare cases, in Bangladesh, maybe it may have worked a little bit, but in other cases, or India, and even there, India is a mess in many ways, and it doesn't want to work with China on that. So, and that's the way the Chinese also do business domestically. It's so they have an ulterior motive for almost everything. It's not production or efficiency. It's how can the official make the most money, which is why the state-run industries companies are running basically at a loss, but the cronies who run them, they're having a good time. They're making a lot of money, and this is why the Chinese economic miracle, which wasn't a miracle but really just a logical consequence of utilizing cheap labor and land and stealing foreign technology and acquiring foreign capital, has run its course, because right now it's basically a credit bubble, a huge credit bubble, where the low-hanging fruit of building infrastructure and houses and railways and stuff like that has been exhausted, and now you'd actually have to go into become a market economy where the capital is allocated according to market-based needs and not according to official cronies. I mean, obviously, I would argue that a market development would have yielded much higher growth rates and much more results anyway, but now even the growth rates they could achieve before by centrally directing capital, they won't be able to achieve anymore. Why? Because they wasted so much capital. I mean, what generates growth is capital accumulation and innovation, but they wasted so much capital for useless projects that were centrally planned and allocated with ulterior motives in mind. So there's not much growth to be had for that, and any marginal additional project that is allocated according to the same basis will yield even less growth. And that's where, frankly, the economic problems are coming in, where China has hit the middle income trap. At official exchange rates, the average income per capita is less than $7,000. That's much less than what the Japanese have at around 50,000 in the 90s when they hit their credit bubble trap. So yeah, the Chinese, they have a lot of issues. And then here come the next people, the Gordon Changs. They're like, it has to collapse. And that's why I'm also saying, like, not really, because Japan also didn't collapse. And there are so many ways when you control the credit allocation mechanism and you control the banks and you control the bookkeeping. I mean, we saw it in the West in 2008 when all of a sudden so many bookkeeping standards were suspended and banks just weren't allowed to go bankrupt. And the Chinese have been doing that with the local governments already, which technically are bankrupt and defaulted, but because of several bookkeeping gimmicks, they're still out there. So, and until you're ready and willing to really make a clean sweep and clean up all the bad debts, you can have the zombie economy like Japan for a long time, except for because China had everything basically state directed and allocated. It's the spoils of this credit growth are much more uneven, and the average income is lower.
For more than 40 years, top financial experts and private investors from all over the world have gathered for the New Orleans Investment Conference to discover new opportunities and strategies, exchange ideas, and plan for the coming year. To learn more about today's investing environment and updates, join Mark Skousen, Peter Schiff, Brian London, Robert Kiyosaki, Doug Casey, and dozens of other experts at this year's event from the 1st to the 4th of November. Go to NewOrleansConference.com to register today.
What I'm reading from your hearing is that, yes, the Chinese economy under the central planning approach has plateaued, and also its foreign games or its foreign strategies aren't necessarily paying dividends economically. But does that mean that the expansionary ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party or those who rule China or the People's Republic of China, are they going to come undone by their own failings?
Well, eventually they have to. I mean, it's the same as the Japanese, who were buying up all sorts of, the people thought in the 90s that the Japanese are going to take over America because they were buying so much property and so many companies, and the Chinese sort of tried to do the same. But yeah, of course, I mean, eventually, if you can't back up your money with production, then you're going to have an issue, and the yuan is probably going to devalue, and that means they can buy fewer foreign things, and they can make fewer resources available to bribe African officials. I mean, again, it's a huge country, it's a huge economy. Does that mean they won't have anything left? No, of course not. I mean, they're bigger than Japan right now, but will they have enough left, or can they allocate enough of the resources to bribe foreign people and invest in ineffective projects abroad? And then another thing is, what's the use? Again, even if you make Pakistan subservient to your own goals and needs, I mean, what's the benefit if you cannot solve the situation at home? If you have a huge credit collapse, you can't produce it, you can't use your capacity. I mean, Pakistan is not going to make up for the import demand of the United States or even domestic industry once that unwinds. So if you're asking me, is it going to go on and become much bigger and more successful? And is China going to take over the world? I would say definitely not. But if you ask me, will it stop completely and they're going to withdraw and just sort out their own issues? That's also definitely not. So probably the situation that we have right now, if they can manage and not go bust and sort of postpone and extend and pretend, then we're just going to have what we have right now for the foreseeable future. The only thing that I do think is possible, because of the domestic stress and also because of the pressure through the trade that President Trump is putting on them, that the yuan might devalue significantly in the not so very distant future.
What do the economic challenges, what impact do they have on, let's say, the glaring civil liberties problems domestically? So I'm not an expert on this. This is why I've got you on. Of course, I don't understand exactly what is going on, for example, with the ethnic cleansing in China. And apparently there's some kind of citizenship score people have now. I mean, obviously free speech, that's out the door. And I've even read that there's basically eugenics research going on in China. So there's a heck of a lot going on there that is unsavory, to say the least. Is this changing anytime soon or just getting worse?
Ooh, that's another tricky one because so first of all, your principal assessment is correct. China is one of the worst countries for basic freedom, and which we all know is based on property rights. And even though they have allowed some property rights, but that's sanctioned by the state. It's not an absolute. And freedom to your body, which for many people who don't agree with the Communist Party or who are of a different ethnicity, like the Uyghurs, or you happen to practice a spiritual practice like Falun Gong, then those freedoms don't exist at all, and you may get killed and tortured. So, and it is true that the control is getting worse in some ways with the surveillance and the score, et cetera, et cetera. So that's definitely not good. But what we see from our vantage point, and we've gotten some intel on that, is that President Xi Jinping he is in favor, at least, of easing up on the persecution of the Falun Gong practitioners, which we think believes is a giant waste, even from the communist perspective. But what does he need to achieve in order to do that? And this is where it becomes interesting, because you have to see that Jiang Zemin, the former president, he started the persecution against the Falun Gong, and he put in all his cronies to important posts, like the security minister, Zhu Yongkang. He was important. He was also the head of the petroleum faction. And now what do you do if you say your long-term game plan is at least to one group? And this is really a big deal in China. It's like there were 100 million people doing Falun Gong in the 90s. You want to give freedom to them, but you've got all those people invested in the persecution of that who is still in power. So if really your long-term game plan is to give freedom to those and maybe freedom to others, more freedom to others, then at first you have to get rid of the crooks. And obviously, how do you, in a communist society, how do you get rid of the crooks? You cement your own power and you abuse any kind of state power that you have at your disposal, like the anti-corruption laws, and use those to get rid of those people. And we can definitely track very clearly that he has gotten, disproportionately, he's gotten rid of Jiang Zemin cronies like Zhu Yongkang and Bo Xilai. They were the biggest figures, but many others in the anti-corruption campaign, they were old Jiang Zemin cronies, and she just basically got rid of them. Now, this is our understanding of how things go. But obviously we don't have a guarantee for that. So it looks like one communist faction is purging another communist faction. It's not like we haven't seen this before in history. And then what's the outcome gonna be? Is it Soviet Union type of scenario where you have Gorbachev cementing his power and then basically providing more freedom, relatively speaking? I mean, it's not like Russia is a fantastic place, but compared to old Soviet times, probably better than then. Or is it going to be a Stalin case where, he grabs the power and gets rid of everybody, and then it's going to be Xi Jinping time for the next 50 years? I would personally believe the indications that we have, it's going to be more of the Gorbachev scenario, even without the dissolution of the Communist Party. Who knows when that is going to happen, but that's definitely a possibility. But the other case is not off the table, judging by the actions of what the Chinese regime leader is doing at this moment.
One of the reasons why I see the China issue as so important is that obviously we have the United States as the dominant world power, and we can all criticize the United States for intervention around the world, many of it being counterproductive. However, at least when the United States engages abroad, there's some sort of democratic accountability. And my fear is that if the Chinese were to gain more influence around the world, they would basically be exporting their suppressive ways. Are there examples of this where the Chinese are exporting basically their communist or top-down, I'm not sure, Marxist-Leninist approaches?
Well, yeah, I think you probably know best that Venezuela is a good example where at least, it's not like those crooks needed to learn from the Chinese, but the Chinese did prop them did prop them up for a long time, because without all the loans that are now in default from China, that regime might have collapsed a long time ago. The same is true with Cuba, and I don't know who else but yeah, pretty much any criminal or government or even private organization. I think that the Chinese, they also support the Mexican drug cartels. They get propped up at least by the Chinese. I don't think the crooks of this world need to learn from the Chinese, or nor do they want to. Obviously, the North Koreans are propped up by them, but they're definitely, the Chinese are helping them for sure. And with the more resources they have, the more they can help out those corrupt and criminal regimes and crooks around the world.
I hear you. Yeah, I mean, Venezuela is a most blatant case where the regime there, of course, has relied on Chinese debt and other support, and that has just allowed a brutal dictatorship to remain in power. So it wasn't necessarily like the Chinese were exporting it, but they were maintaining it. Now, maybe you want to comment, this is perhaps more sensitive, about how the United States should or could address the problem of China in a way that leads to a maybe more benevolent or more liberalized country in the next decades, in the coming decades. Okay,
so yeah, that's a good question. So how do we know? I actually attended a pretty interesting speech. It was interesting, but I forgot the guy's name. But he talked about how the other statist countries of Asia transformed. And Taiwan is an interesting example because Taiwan was a right-wing dictatorship. Yeah, and they kind of did a similar thing. They just, let the economy loose, but then they kept the power, the political power. And they just then realized that eventually they wouldn't keep power anymore. So they just let it transition to a democracy. Very good example. But you need that type of enlightened leader like a Gorbachev to be able to do that. We don't know whether Xi Jinping is that. And I'm going to come back to the United States after I sort of evaluate the scenarios. Now, South Korea, interestingly enough, they were also under sort of dictatorship, where there was one guy, I forgot the name, who, he didn't want to let go of power. And he got killed by their own intelligence agency. And then it became more democratic. So we get a couple of different scenarios, but one scenario is just, so we have a couple of top-down scenarios where the cronies themselves could say, we're going to just allow more freedom in general. Or we could have some parts, a faction of the cronies say, okay, now it's enough, and we're going to stage a sort of coup. Or it could come from the people, and how does any? I mean, I think India's even though it's a mess now, I think the example how they gained independence from the British is great, because it was by non-violent, passive resistance, just withdrawing their support for the cronies. And the more Chinese people get that, then the sooner we can see a transition to a democracy or something even better. I mean, both of us, believe that people, they don't necessarily need a government, and who knows, maybe it's the Chinese who are going to pioneer that. That would be awesome. So how can the United States bring that about? I think there's two ways. So one way is the one which President Trump is going, and it's basically not cooperating with the cronies, which is what the Chinese people should do. Don't cooperate with the cronies. And who are the cronies? It's the people in charge of all the companies who have most of the exports, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them. There's also private people who don't have anything to do with it, but most of it is still run by the Communist Party clique and their cronies. So don't cooperate with them. How do you not cooperate with them? It's by, I read this article about this crazy shipping treaty that they had. The Chinese can ship stuff for less than $1 on USPS, whereas Americans cannot, and that's why the Chinese can sell counterfeit goods coming from China cheaper than the original products made in the United States. So don't do that. Don't cooperate with them on that level. Don't give them the preferable treatment that they have on the WTO. Raise the tariff to the same level at the very least. So all of this stuff, don't let them buy your stuff here in the United States so they can gut the companies and export their technology. So these are all ways that as government, which is managing trade and international relations, can basically not cooperate with that regime, and that will cause problems sooner or later. Like, what's the guy's name? Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB defector.
Yes.
Yeah, he was like, why do you keep sending corn and food to the Soviet regime? Yeah, it's nice of you that you don't want the people there to starve, but at the end of the day, you're still propping up the regime. And now with China, the issue is the same on trade. Now, having said that, by now, the global production chains are so intertwined, and in a way, you really do need China to churn out products at a certain scale and at a certain price and with a certain quality. So don't kid yourself that this non-cooperation won't come at a price. There will be a price to pay. But all things considered, the price that the cronies are going to be paying is higher than the US consumers are going to be paying. Second solution, which obviously nobody's thinking about, but I did write an article on that, is stop worrying so much about what's going on internationally and focus more on what's going on nationally. And President Trump and the Republicans are already going in that direction. Obviously not far enough, because my proposition is if you scrap all taxes, and I'm serious, like all tax, like, we had back before the Federal Reserve, and most regulations, I would like to say all regulations, but let's say most regulations, then this country would be so competitive and so prosperous that the state control, even if it's 1.3 billion, state controlled Chinese, they could not afford to buy one of your better companies. And they could not compete with your prices, even though the wages are going to be 100 times higher. Obviously, that would take time, et cetera, but that would be another way to go. And then the Chinese can just do whatever they want to do, because the United States will be even more prosperous and competitive and happy and easier to defend than under the current status quo.
Mate, that's an inspiring way, to finish off. If people want to follow Valentin's work, and obviously I write for as well, the Epoch Times, I really am proud to do so and see it as a valuable source. So it's just, in English, it is theepochtimes.com. The original Chinese is epochtimes.com. And you can find him also on Twitter. Now, are there any other places where people should follow your work? Just the Epoch Times and your Twitter releases? Where else are you active?
I'm on Bold TV fairly frequently. That's a new independent internet program, bold.tv. That's interesting. And then I also talk every once in a while on the Correlin Economics Report. That's the kereport.com. That's a syndicated radio show. That's what I'm doing mostly at the moment. Yeah, and of course, mostly at this point, editing, including your work. But after I sorted out some workflow issues, I definitely want to get back into
more of your own
writing more again. Yeah,
excellent. Yes, so bold.tv and the Correlin Economics Report. Brian London, one of the co-hosts of this show, also appears on that podcast. So we'll post all these links at goldnewsletter.com/podcast. Thanks so much to all the listeners. I really appreciate your support. We're coming up on 2 years with the show, and with the New Orleans Investment Conference is just, less than 2 weeks away. So I'm excited to see many of you there. Otherwise, I'll just say, Valentin, it's a pleasure or a privilege to be a friend of yours, and we appreciate your insights.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.